an excellent discussion that would actually be a jumpstart for a keynote session this afternoon. Some of the questions that, great questions that we heard from the audience that were not addressed in public, maybe we'll have time to come back to them after this session and definitely the rest of the day. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce our keynote speaker for our first keynote speaker for today, Professor Gabriella Blum. Professor Blum is a Rita Hauser Professor of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law at Harvard Law School. She's the faculty director of the program on international law and armed conflict and a member of the executive board of the program on negotiation. Prior to joining Harvard Law School, she served for 7 years as a senior legal advisor of the International Law Department of the Military Advocate General Corps in the Israeli Defense Forces. Is all the names in
a lot of titles.
All the Israeli names are really very long. She was also a strategy advisor to the Israeli National Security Council. Her book, The Future of Violence, Robots and Germs, Hackers and Drones, Confronting a New Age of Threat, which was published in 2015, is a thought-provoking book and that raised a lot of very challenging issues related to new technology. It's a great read and I really recommend it highly to all of you. We're really delighted to have you here. Thank you for joining us. Please join me in welcoming Professor Blum.
Thank you very much, Niva. Thank you for inviting me to join you here in this very beautiful venue. It's been a terrific pleasure to be here in the last couple of days, yesterday in Jerusalem, today here. I learned a lot from the presentations that I've heard. So this presentation is based on the book that I co-authored with Benjamin Wittes from the Brookings Institution. And just, this is how technology moves. In the last couple of years, things that we sort of imagined as future sci-fi have become a reality. I think I'll allude to some of those. There are sort of 3 key points that you'll notice through the presentation. So I'll just, tell you them in advance, sort of spoiler alert. The first is that though this conference is dedicated to cyber technology and cybersecurity, when one thinks about security, one needs to think about cyber as one technology of mass empowerment that corresponds, augments, interacts with other technologies of mass empowerment. And I would like to talk about the synergy of these technologies and how they all affect our personal and national security. The second point is that contrary to what I've heard Aviv Zohar say yesterday, I'm not as optimistic that the good guys always win and the bad guys all end up in jail. And so I think you'll see that I don't have strong priors on that, but I have more concerns that were not completely assuaged by his presentation on cryptography. And the third, and that harks back to Professor Chinmay's Arun's presentation yesterday, that when we think about solutions, we tend to think about them, and maybe we ought to think about them as socially, politically, and culturally, locally contingent, that they need to fit the specific requirements of the particular locality you're talking about. At the same time, however, because these technologies are globalized, because we live in a globalized world, whatever solution that we adopt in one place ends up affecting solutions in other places and vice versa. We live in an interconnected world, and the choices we need to make end up being global in nature. Okay, so let's start with the synergy, and let's start with a thought experiment. You walk into your shower and you find a spider. No? There it is. Okay. Now, there are several options. One is that the spider is a real one. Odds are it's harmless to the extent spiders are harmless. The second possibility is that your neighbor who dislikes your noisy dog has sent this surveillance spider and is now sitting at a local sports bar relaying pictures of you naked on the TV screens to the mirth of the entire neighborhood. She can operate it easily from her iPhone. A yet more menacing possibility is that your business competitor, who is currently vacationing in Provence, has purchased a lethal spider drone from a bankrupt military contractor. He's directing the mini drone spider to shoot an infinitesimal needle into your left thigh. That needle is armed with synthetic poison. You're dead. The spider emerges out of a crack in the window and then is ordered to self-destruct. Neither the spider drone nor the business competitors are ever found. Okay, so all of that sounds very much like sci-fi, but these models of drones are already available today from various vendors, from various markets. If you look at the bottom right side, this is a cockroach that was just recently announced by the Russian government. As if the original wasn't nasty enough, now it comes in a drone model. And many of these things already come with surveillance capacity on them. Making them lethal is the next step, and it's not that complicated. Now, I want to show you how a private company called TechJet is advertising a mini flying dragonfly drone that it is selling on the private market.
This is Matt, and I'm Jay. We are the developers for the next generation in microflying robots called the Dragonfly.
For hundreds of years, man has looked to the sky to fly like a bird. Our inspiration comes from one insect in particular, the dragonfly, with unmatched flight performance in the insect world. The TechJet Dragonfly is a lightweight robotic insect that collects and relays information while flying like a bird or hovering like an insect. Weighing in at less than 1 ounce, approximately the weight of a AA battery, the Dragonfly is the latest in ultra-micro avionics with stereoscopic vision, flight control systems, and a camera-ready operating system. This means you can do amazing aerial photography, spy on people, secure your house, or use it as the next-gen gaming platform.
So spying people is a great throughout the defense establishment, academia, private sector, there is an attempt to make these machines more nimble, smaller, and operate with greater autonomy, meaning less human control. And the next step is this, which you'll see is a formation called swarms of machines, moving together informations, being directed only initially, the initial step, but then operating in a formation flight without added human control.
The method to transition between formations in 3D.
So in this video, they dance, they do all kinds of fun things, but eventually they can also do facial recognition. So you throw 10,000s of those onto an open field and they zoom in on the target you want them to identify. Let's go back to the question of poison. How far are we from synthesizing agent or biological agent in a laboratory? Well, poison has been around for millennia, that's not news. But we're getting better and better at bioengineering, which overall is a great thing to humanity, but it has its own perils. This is a slide of the H5n1 virus that researchers in the United States and Germany collaborated on studying by turning the virus to be more contagious and more lethal. Now, they had no malevolent aspirations. This was an academic scientific exercise. But when they were about to publish their results in both Nature and Science, the top scientific magazines in the United States, the government got a little bit antsy and thought, well, you know, we're not sure we really want this information in the public domain. And after much discussion at the NIH and the CDC and the relevant federal agencies responsible, the realization was that at this point, there's no possibility of preventing the research from being published. That by the time the researchers have presented the work and have been involved with it, and numerous people involved in the process, it's just impossible to block that information, and that information is indeed now available to you and me. Now, a decade before the H5n1 controversy, researchers in Australia worked in a laboratory on the mouse pox. Now, the idea was to make the mouse pox infect mice to sterilize them as a rodent control measure. But in fact, the work was so effective that it ended up killing the mice. It was much more potent than they had imagined. Mouse pox is not lethal in humans, but smallpox is, and is a close relative of that same virus. So this is still of the technologies of mass empowerment I'm interested in, the least massively available, but it is becoming more and more so. So this is a company called BioBricks that advertises online, and you and I can go online and purchase genetic sequences, genetic laboratory equipment, and information on how to synthesize genes. And of course, this still requires some expertise, but what used to be the province of the most expert scientists is now becoming a commonplace for the graduate student. And remember, this is a technology or potentially a weapon of mass destruction in its capacity and capabilities. Okay, cyber is what we often talk about as the most obvious technology of mass empowerment. This is our interest here. And indeed, we have all kinds of cyber struggles or weapons or attacks launched, whether it's government by governments, Russia and Estonia, the Russian hacking of the US elections or meddling in the US elections, or the joint Israeli-US attack on the Iranian nuclear program. But there's also attacks by states against individuals or corporations, most notably the North Korean attack on Sony, Chinese government attacking human rights activists, or US-based Ethiopian journalists who were also hacked by their own government. And of course, there are also the individuals or non-state actors who try to harm governments. In the book, we talk about one case that was famous in Israel, a guy by the name of Itamar. He was, as far as we know, there are all kinds of rumors about it, a Saudi national operating from a cafe in Mexico, hacking the El Al, the national airlines website, and taking it down. We had, apropos the hacking elections, turns out it doesn't take a government. There was a Colombian citizen who bragged to the news media and was interviewed on how he rigged elections in 9 Latin American countries in the last few years. And the famous UK teenager was caught attempting to hack into the CIA chief's computer. The capacity of 16-year-olds to wreak havoc today is quite unparalleled in history. And there are also always the non-state actors to non-state actors, the famous anonymous group that hacked Children's Hospital in Boston over a controversy over their treatment of a particular patient, ransomware, all kinds of things that we've talked about, whether politically motivated, ideologically, boredom, or greed. Now, beyond the sort of normal or everyday kind of financial crimes that we hear on the internet, identity theft or credit card theft, I want you to pause and think about this guy. This guy's name is Luis Mijangos. He was a resident of Northern California, and he wrote his own malware that was intended to infect and did in fact infect the webcams or entered through the webcams of laptops of women or young women and girls, dozens of them. And while he infiltrated the webcam, he took pictures of them in all kinds of compromising positions, and then used those pictures to do what the FBI called sextort his victims into making sex tapes for him. So this is a very real consequence beyond the cyberspace. The cyber is just the means to inflict great harm. The silver lining in this story was that because Mijangos was in Northern California, the FBI managed to track him back, search his computers, arrest him, bring him to justice, and he's now serving jail time. But Mijangos just as easily could have written and sent his malware from anywhere around the world, anywhere that the FBI and no US authorities have any jurisdiction. So you guys have mentioned in the previous panel the Internet of Things. This is on the more sort of comical side. This guy really became famous by writing a review on Amazon of a product that allows you to control your thermostat from afar, climate control. And his ex-wife left him, took his house, his car, his retirement accounts, and is now, as he says, living in his former house with her new partner. And the only revenge he can take is make sure that they wake up to 5 degrees centigrade or 40 degrees Fahrenheit every morning. And who doesn't want to wake up? And he talks about all of this, and in his defense, he does give the product a 5-star review of sort of controlling the climate from afar. Sort of becoming more worrisome, the following are 2 stories published by Wired magazine. One talks about this sharpshooter that is computer enabled, originally to allow the shooter to better aim and target. Now, it turns out that you can hack that computer and make it impossible for the shooter to control her aim or fire. You basically take control over that. The same thing happens in this Jeep Chrysler, that it turns out you can hack through the entertainment system of the car. They asked a driver to drive that Jeep on an interstate highway with all kinds of trucks and fast-moving cars, and the driver had no control over the car. The hackers basically took control over it through their computer, and later it became known that at least 11 car makes in not just in the United States, but in Europe, around the world, are susceptible to the same kind of hacking. So for this crowd, I don't need to define artificial intelligence or machine learning. You guys are experts. We can just very quickly go on that. I do want to talk about one exchange, or go back to one exchange that Professor Gal had with the audience about how much do we actually know about these algorithms. Alphago, which is from Google Mind, developed this Go algorithm that is supposed to beat, and did in fact beat, Go experts around the world. Now, just to make it concrete how much intelligence, if you want, is necessary, if you take the game of chess, after the first 2 moves, there are about 400 possible third moves. In the game of Go, there are closer to 130,000. So the initial machine they built was already better than any human player, but over time the machine got better and better and better, and AlphaGo couldn't possibly explain why. So they had no idea why the machine is getting better, or what they could say machine learning, but to point exactly at what was learned or how the process of learning, they could not. So what are the implications, for me at least, is that we are creating, on top of the many wonderful things we're creating, also something we can call the perfect weapon, that is distant, is invisible, and potentially untraceable. Now, an important point to remember is that no one has a monopoly over this kind of technology. So there is a company in Bedford, Massachusetts, not far from where I live, called iRobot. And iRobot produces drones for the military, and it also makes the Roomba, your friendly autonomous or robot vacuum cleaner. And the same companies that develop military technologies develop private technologies, and indeed there is no difference between one or the other. Globalization means that everything that is developed in one place becomes available in a different place, and costs are dropping very rapidly, very significantly, making this technology accessible to all of us. So if you want to think about the difference between this kind of stuff and nuclear weapons, we all talk about nuclear weapons and dirty bombs and stuff. Turns out it's a really difficult thing to come up with a nuclear weapon. You need material, you need infrastructure, you need knowledge, you need all those things that are very much still protected. None of this meets those requirements. It's widely available, everything is by definition dual use. And offense is probably better than defense, and I want to emphasize, this is an arms race where everybody becomes stronger. This is not to suggest that non-state actors are becoming stronger and states are weaker. The state wins from this technology a great deal, but you do have to defend yourself against any known or unknown vulnerability. That's much harder. Plus, not all states are similarly situated. And when we talk about how the state is empowered, we tend to think about the United States or Israel, but most governments around the world do not have those resources or capacity to defend themselves in the same way. Okay. So if you take everything I said and bring it to extreme, we imagine a world that we call many-to-many threats. In the world of many-to-many threats, and again, this is an extreme thought exercise, every individual, group, corporation, or state is a threat to any other individual, group, corporation, or state anywhere around the world. That's the many-to-many threat, and how do we control it? So in 1651, Thomas Hobbes writes his Leviathan. He begins from suggesting that we used to all be in the state of nature. This is, of course, a thought experiment, and in the state of nature, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. We don't want to be in that world, and therefore we come together through a social contract and surrender our powers to the Leviathan. That is the justification to the modern nation state. That will protect us from all the little brothers out there. Almost 4 decades later, John Locke added an important amendment to Hobbes's Leviathan theory, accepting many of the same premises, but reminding us that the state itself, the Leviathan itself, the big brother, is as much a source of a threat as it is a source of protection, and we need some checks and protections from that actor as well. In the intervening centuries until today, a whole stratum, if you want, of additional powerful actors in the guise of multinational corporation has emerged. They are neither exactly states nor citizens, and they wield a lot of power, whether they intend to or not. They are consumers of technology, they're users of technology, they disseminate that technology, and through that they can affect our security for better or worse. And this is just a list of all the big corporations that today are empowered by AI. Travel, you guys mentioned the travel, websites, banking systems, entertainment system, investments, technology, and much more. And remember, all this technology is dual use. Once TripAdvisor knows how to make its algorithms better, everyone else knows how to do that too. So what are the challenges of the social contract today? We need to fear the big brother. We need to fear many little brothers. There's this whole set of corporations in the middle, and remember, any of them can be anywhere around the world affecting our security. What do we do? Okay. So I don't have a panacea, but some just initial thoughts to sort of frame the discussion. We tend to think about liberty and security as a balancing act, that you trade a little bit for of one to gain more of the other, that it's sort of a zero-sum game. But I don't think that's right. I don't think that's right, and I don't think that's a helpful way of thinking about it. I want to suggest that a better way of thinking about it is something we call the hostile symbiosis. This is a biology term, where two agents are mutually dependent. They can be mutually hostile, but they're also mutually dependent, and one cannot exist without the other. So go back to our world. We cannot have any meaningful liberty without an underlying security, and our security is meaningless if we can't exercise liberty. If you want to take an extreme example, if we really thought that liberty and security were substitutes, North Korea would be the safest country in the world, Somalia would be the freest country in the world. We don't often think about either place as exempling these values. So let's take concrete examples. Airport screening, airport security. We call it screening, we call it security. We never call it airport surveillance because we don't like that term. But in fact, it is surveillance. It's exactly what it does. So we call it screening because it kind of invites us to participate, and we do. Now, why do we participate? Because A, we have to, but there is also a rationale behind it that we value both our safety and our liberty to fly. And we wouldn't fly if we didn't feel safe doing that, and that's just a fact. The same way we think about protecting our medical data. We don't think about trading security for privacy. We think that protecting medical data actually protects both our security and our privacy. And we find the regulatory kind of balance that maximizes both these values, doesn't trade one against the other. So when we think about domestic governance, we believe there will have to be much more regulation and monitoring of these technologies, of manufacturers, of distributors. Now, regulation is a social and political choice. There's nothing inherent in regulation that makes it good or bad. It's a social and political choice. Let's take two examples. The first is very American, but we can find examples anywhere. Guns. So the United States made a political and social choice embedded in the Second Amendment of the Constitution to make the holding of guns a liberty protected by the Bill of Rights. And so we allow people to carry guns, enormous amounts of guns, very lethal guns, and we deal with the consequences. Now I want you to think about a different technology of mass empowerment, the passenger car. Think about it for a second. The passenger car is a 2-ton steel machine that moves on high speeds on public roadways by people who are more or less expert at driving them, among lots of other people. You think about it for a second, it sounds utterly crazy, right? And very unsafe. How do we make it safe, or at least safe to a tolerable degree? We have a very intricate system of licensing, of testing, of registration, of insurance, of both the car and the driver. And we don't normally have a conversation about whether we have an inalienable right to drive or to drive anonymously, for that matter. And we say, no, being known is part of the requirement to operate a machine that can cause great harm to others. So a certain kind of this regulation will have to be applied to the main corporations, or any corporation, depending on degree and capacity, that affects our security, whether directly or indirectly. And that brings me to the idea of intermediary regulation. And here's a different analogy taken from food and drugs, okay, through consumer protection. The government cannot make sure that the food you eat or the drugs you take are safe. It doesn't have the manpower, it doesn't have the expertise, it can't do it. What it does is impose obligations on the companies that do provide you with food, the manufacturers, the distributors, the providers, that give you food or medicine to make sure they're safe. And if they're not safe, there are legal consequences to that failure. And we believe that model too will apply to our age of technology. Back to the idea of global governance, whatever regulatory choice we use, whether direct regulation, intermediary regulation, licensing, identity, or whatever, again, we need to remember that we live in a global governance world. And so the problem is how to get the cooperation of others. It was mentioned in the last session of Microsoft's initiative to launch a Digital Geneva Convention. There's been attempts to harness or regulate for the financial industry a certain code through the G8. The G8 initiative ended up being a G7 adoption because the United States wouldn't play ball. And as you'll, I don't know if this is known to everyone or not, the United States is actually the actor that is least cooperative on most of these initiatives, whether in the area of state-to-state international security or even the more private sphere of financial industries. And so the UN tried a cyber warfare talks. All these initiatives have failed. In fact, on the international level, the only game in town is Mike Schmidt's working group through NATO, the Italian manual. The rest are not officially governmental. And we think that these informal or unofficial path is the way to go, including something that is an important lesson about self-regulation. So there's much to learn from the CRISPR case. CRISPR is a gene editing technology that allows you to take a bad gene or a malfunctioning gene and slice it in particular points and either re-edit the gene or rewrite over it. And there were a lot of ethical concerns about the use of CRISPR and sort of human engineering. And in 2015, the International Association of Bioengineers came together and adopted, again, this is non-governmental, this is voluntary, code that would prohibit the use of CRISPR on embryos in order to establish a pregnancy. And they said, we're not going to do that. This is a self-adoption rule. And we think, and we already see, that industry-specific regulations that are voluntarily taken are going to be the path forward. Where does all of this leave us? With every new technology, there are threats of Armageddon. That's not what we believe. In fact, when I first presented this spider drones that I was fascinated by, I have a good friend who's a psychiatrist who told me, you know, Gabby, and I called it Invisible Threats. That was the title of the essay I wrote. And he told me, you know, Gabby, invisible threats is the definition of paranoia, okay? So I do not mean to be paranoid, and I think by and large technology is a wonderful thing that is going to promote our welfare and bring us to much better places. Most of us are going to use technology only for the most benevolent or just benign purposes. It's only a small minority that is going to use it to harm or for harm. Problem is that a small minority of a world of 7.5 billion people is a lot of people. And so what we ultimately call for in the book is to sort of move away from slogans, yes surveillance, no surveillance, the big brother, the evil, the freedom fighters, the black hackers, black hats, white hats, and really think about the very hard choices that we need to make as a society in order to allow us all the benefits of technology without putting us at an intolerable risk. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to hear a short comment from Dr. Itamar Mann from the Faculty of Law. Whatever.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. This is an important book. This was an incredibly timely book when it was published about 2 years ago. It's titled The Future of Violence, and as Professor Blum herself had hinted, I think today we might call it the present of violence. What I would like to do today is two things. I would like first to contextualize the book a little bit in what I think was the historical moment in which it was published, and a little bit going into political theory in the intervention that the book attempts to make in social contract theory. I will do this in a slightly polemic way, taking risk that I might not be entirely loyal to the two authors' meaning, and in that way, that is also a question. And after I do that, I would like to more explicitly ask a few questions about the book's general argument. So, starting from a little context. The book, I think, belongs to a genre of writing in technology that is generally can be put under the title of the cultural lag argument. So this title comes from a work by a famous sociologist who published in 1922, William Ogburn, a paper called Social Change with Respect to Culture and Original Nature. And the claim there is simple. Culture is always constantly lagging behind the development of technology. And therefore, what we need to do when we study technology in society, we need to perform an exercise of adjustment. Culture is maladjusted, and it needs, in other words, to catch up. And I think the basic argument here is that the discussion on privacy that has developed in the United States, basically starting from the Edward Snowden revelations in 2013, its concept of privacy was maladjusted. It did not fit the idea of privacy that would be, of liberties and of privacy that would be appropriate for a world that is interconnected through digital communications and through the hard wiring and infrastructures of the digital communication. And when I emphasize 2013 and the Snowden revelations, I do that in an informed way. I believe that the book is also intended as a polemic against the kind of fixation on the notion of privacy that has developed among liberal as well as non-liberal commentators around this time, and who were really justifiably, but perhaps in a misled way, fixated on the idea that the government is encroaching upon our civil liberties, as imagined, as was said in a previous presentation, through a kind of metaphor of telephony and communications from previous era. And I think Wittes and Professor Blum come to this conversation, come to this table, see all these mushrooming privacy centers in the United States and elsewhere, and they say, maybe if this has become the kind of obvious truth of this debate, there is an important question to ask about it, and we need to look at, and the very fact that it is seemingly so agreed upon requires maybe a little bit more of a questioning. And to do that, Professor Blum has emphasized in her presentation here in a very effective way the threats, the deep threats that do exist in the World Wide Web. I won't repeat that, but I will a little bit emphasize the argument that they make around social contract theory. So they go back to classical theorists of social contracts and contract, including Hobbes, Locke, Grotius, Rousseau, and they present an insight that I think is a very basic insight in its essence of social contract, especially, in my view, in the Hobbesian tradition. What do I mean by this? I mean to say that when they spend their energy on showing that liberty and privacy do not, in fact, weigh against each other, they're actually pointing to the very condition of political liberty, which is the formation of a social contract through the granting of the monopoly over violence to a sovereign. We cannot have privacy if we don't have a sovereign that will protect us all within this context of a social contract. And okay, so here I agree very much so far. I too, my humble self, also believes that the notion, that the fixation on privacy doesn't allow us to see certain aspects of the very important questions that arise from the Snowden revelations, as well as the many-to-many threat that Blum has emphasized here. However, I do think, and here I will move to a little bit more to questions that do have a little bit more about possible omissions of this general argument, that there are certain things that the way the story is presented here does not allow us to see fully, or could be developed in a direction that would be informative. And I'm thinking of two basic ideas. And let me preface them by a kind of insight from the sociological study of crime. Law and Society has long found that crime is not, the legal tradition of Law and Society is not only about bad actors. It's not only about benevolent and malevolent intentions. It's also about the social structures that exist in the background that create criminals and create people who are law-abiding citizens. So there is a kind of threat of crime, that it is a serious threat, but it also may be a mistake to regard it as a question of single bad actors that exist in multiple places in the world at the same time. Going back to the critiques through the social contract prism that I would like to present here, these are essentially two. The first, and I think here the book does do some important work, is about moving from a conversation about privacy to a conversation that is much more thickly about political participation, about self-determination, about transparency, and issues of civic government. I think that a large part of the discussion that developed around the privacy period of the debate really omitted the way that, for example, in the negotiations that existed between Germany, Brazil, and the United States following the leaked wiretapping of Merkel and others, the conversation developed around basic constitutional questions of constitutional structure. And I say again, the book does go into that, but I think there's more to do on these issues of how to preserve democratic self-governance in a context of this multipolar world with many-to-many threats. The second issue that I think it maybe is less addressed in the book is the issue of distribution. So sociologists of law and society of people oftentimes tell us that when we see problems of crime, the background structures that are relevant are distributive, go back to distributive questions. And when we talk about a global social contract, which is ultimately what the book concludes with, or an international social contract rather, we need to ask what are the conditions of consent for such a social contract to exist, and do we have those conditions in the background when we came to the historical moment when this book was published. And my contention is to say no, we did not have these conditions. We didn't have conditions in which it was rational to give consent to a social contract based on existing distribution of wealth around the world. And if we are to eliminate at least part of the many-to-many threats, we need also to expand the conversation and ask the question, who benefits from the development for development's sake, as Professor Garam said in a previous panel. So I have a little bit more to say, but I'd like to conclude here with the anticipation that there will be a very lively conversation. Thank you.
Shortly, you want to answer or respond, and then we'll have more time for questions.
Itamar, thank you very much. These are wonderful comments. Let me say just, I think that it is biographically interesting, maybe just narcissistically interesting, but maybe interesting. It's true that Ben came to this kind of our partnership through this cyber arena. He was already doing a lot of work on cyber. I was new to it. At the time, I was doing work on targeted killings. And everyone was fascinated by this idea of drones killing people off in Yemen, in Gaza, in places around the world. We're fascinated and completely enthralled in this question of should the government be able to target individuals outside zone of hostilities or within the zone of hostilities. And looking more and more at the technology, what bothered me is that this is much greater than the conversation is about. This is not about killing someone in Yemen in or in conjunction with an armed conflict. This is a technology. You could go on eBay, you can buy yourself a drone. You can try it. And there is a website called DIY Drones that if you're looking for a weekend hobby with your family, teaches you how to build a drone. And of course they have a disclaimer and they say, you know, it's only for the most, benign hobby kind of a pastime activity, but of course you have no control over what people do with that information once it is. So it wasn't, you're right that part of the sort of biographical story of the book has to do with a discussion of privacy, but not all of it. In fact, what drove me was sort of the democratization of violence and the implication of it across these three different technologies, and looking at, you know, the next step is nanotechnology and all of that. I think everything you say about the big questions of distribution, about sovereignty, about what we called the question of the future of the state, which is, I think, the question Ben and I would both like to explore further. We start touching on it in the book. We don't do enough. There's lots more to say. And I think everything you say is absolutely correct. The biggest question is, how do you conceive of sovereignty today? What does it mean to be a sovereign state? What are your rights? What are your obligations? Who gets to participate in your decision making? The fact that through globalization, we affect a greater and greater number of people who do not have a vote. You know, one could ask, why is it so outrageous that the Russians try to affect the elections in the United States, given that a lot of what the United States ends up doing does affect Russia? So we could talk about the innocence or lack thereof, their motivations. But it's not at all clear to me that governments should not or don't, in fact, intervene in other places. And there are a lot of questions about, I think, if you want to call it allegiance, you want to call it fiduciary duties, who owes what to whom in this, at this moment, taking into account discrepancies in and disparities in wealth and access and resources and all that. There's much more to say, but I want to allow you to open the floor.
So let's open the floor. Yeah.
I don't know if you call, there's an echo?
Yes.
I don't know if to call you observation, realistic or optimistic, but later on different picture and tell me what's your reaction. Technology is evolving exponentially due to Moore's law or whatever other law, but definitely it's technology. Government, politics, regulation are going linearly at the best case. Most of the case they don't move at all. So why do you have an optimistic view that this gap is going to be narrowing? Because if I look around at legislation and everything, it's not that only that it's lagging, but it's just getting bigger and bigger. How do you think this gap is going to be closed?
I think that's a real concern, and we see it not just in legislation that we know takes a lot of time. Supreme Court decisions, right? So in the United States, so a few years ago, there was a Supreme Court decision that had to ask the question whether a GPS tracking device by the police is a search or not a search, where, you know, every teenager now has this app that allows them to track basically everyone else around them. And so everything, I agree with you, we're always lagging behind. Going back to Itamar's argument that we're always lagging even in our thinking after, certainly in regulation and enforcement. So I think that the principle should be thinking in principles and not in details. So if you think there should be a liability of corporations, for instance, a tort model, then what counts as a reasonable care by a company could be determined according to social norms and technological norms that evolve over time. The initial decision to apply a tort model is a principled decision, okay? The principled decision of whether there should be certain licensing of particular uses of the internet, how we think about the production and dissemination of certain biological agents. Those I think of as remaining at the sort of overall meta level that then we can infuse through administrators, through practice, and through, obviously, you talked about the market, and I think that's a huge force that is going to become a greater player in this sphere. Again, I don't have a magic solution to this problem. I think you're absolutely correct about it.
Rachel.
Hi, thank you for your really interesting and thought-provoking talk. I was thinking as I was watching it though about, I teach a course on computer security and human behavior, and we talked a lot about the way in which people make mistakes when they're perceiving risks. And all of these types of risks that you're talking about are you know, they're malicious, they're novel, sort of risks that we tend to over-perceive rather than under-perceive. And so, I mean, while I'm not saying that we shouldn't be thinking about these things in the great way that you are, I'm almost worried that we might be in a sort of a, poison in Halloween candy sort of situation where people massively inflate these sort of risks that are terrifying and novel, or anthrax versus influenza, this sort of these kinds of things. I'm sure you've thought about it, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Again, I think that's a super fair comment, and to make it even worse for me, one of the things that troubled me a lot as we were writing the bio-threat section is the fact that, I work in security, and for decades now, people have talked about a biological or chemical terrorist attack. And, yes, there are a couple of examples from Japan, from elsewhere, but it hasn't been a phenomenon. And it certainly hasn't been even remotely the kind of threat that people were talking about or fearing. So there are all kinds of possibilities. One is that most people are not that evil and wouldn't want to do it. The other is that people lack imagination, and that terrorism, like lots of other social phenomena, tend to work in clusters. So take suicide bombers, there's an initial movement that uses it, an initial group, and then it gets emulated and copied. And maybe it's just that we stopped history too early in the discussion, and let's have this discussion 20 years from now. And I don't know, and you don't know. Two things that I want to emphasize also is a corollary to what you say that we also need to be very cognizant of, is that governments are very good at ratcheting up security regulations. They're not that good at ratcheting down. So in response to perceived risks, we tend to overreact as a general matter. We're not always good at calibrating down. And again, going back to how quickly do we make these evaluations, so we still take our shoes off at the airports. Unclear whether that's really necessary, but nobody has the political will to stop that. The other point I want to make is, look, for a lot of these things, you don't need fancy technology, right? It doesn't take fancy technology to kill other people. We see that all the time. But it does, however, I think in my mind, brings into the potential circle of violence actors that wouldn't otherwise be there. So just to bring it back to your sort of psychological interest perspective, it takes a particular kind of character to pull a trigger and to click a mouse. And one is not a substitute for the other. The technology, I think, potentially invites additional actors with additional sort of predispositions or characteristics to participate in violent behavior that I do worry about. So it's hard to predict. You may absolutely be right about it. I hope that you are. I'm more worried than you all seem to be.
I have a quick follow-up question. So if we don't perceive the risk right, and if there is dual use and there are unintended consequences, and we want to hold people accountable for the technologies that they develop, and we think about these technologies as writing software, and they're going to be accountable for everything they write, aren't we going to kill innovation, creativity, expression, as opposed to drugs regulation or car accident? There is no particular standard or outcome that we know that we should regulate against. If people are accountable for the unintended consequences of using this software by the bad guys, isn't there a risk that Rachel and her colleagues will stop innovating?
My short, intuitive, and reductionist answer is no. I'm not sure I can convince everyone. I think we're in the business of managing risks. There are risks everywhere. There are the risks I talk about. There are the risks of innovation. There are the risks of making the internet more available, more accessible to more people. There is creativity. There's political speech. There is just having fun, which is also a value that ought to be protected. go back to my Somalia idea, I don't like ungoverned spaces. You know, we like to think about the internet as this virtual world where everything is virtual and happens virtually and is this kind of alternative world that we live in. But our finances are there, our love lives are there, our social lives are there, our professional lives are there. They have real consequences in the world that are not limited to a virtual world. And I would not like to live in any physical space that is not governed. I don't want to live in a virtual place that is not governed. Now, this is just as a first order thing, and I need more proof that it actually hinders creativity or imagination. I'm not talking about the need to protect dissidents or political activists in dictatorships from being revealed. I think then we need to have a discussion about anonymous to whom, just as going back to Itamar's point about privacy. So Judith Thompson said many years ago, we all talk about privacy as this value we want to protect, but nobody has a good definition of it. And in fact, that's right. We talk about privacy, we talk about anonymity, we talk about the information we control versus not control, the information rising up to attack us. There are all kinds of versions of privacy that we want to protect in some contexts and not either give it up freely or are not, it's not there to begin with in other contexts. And I have the same kind of intuition about anonymity. I want to know why anonymity is important, in what context it is important, and I want accountability as much as I want anonymity. I want to know that if something goes wrong, and we can have a big argument over what goes wrong and how do we know, but that somebody also has the ability to intervene and do something about it. So a world where everything is super meta encrypted and nobody has the keys to anything, I don't feel safe.
So you don't like Bitcoin?
If only I had more of it.
So you're a rich woman?
Okay. And then
So first, thank you. I really enjoyed the presentation and the comments on the presentation. The concern that I have is the intersection of the two pieces that you just described. Right? That a lot of the biggest risks are limited by that lack of imagination and the structures of how things go wrong. And I'm particularly concerned, as was alluded to earlier, about the AI black box. The order of magnitude of the Alpha Plus in the Go example that you gave was that the new program learned in 2 years what took the first program 10, and an order of magnitude of sophistication that was considered impossible by technologists 10 years earlier. And so is there a credible risk that in harnessing AI for some of the pedestrian villainy, the pedestrian tools of war, a bad actor will in fact create that black box that has no limits and lead us to the singularity or whatever you want to describe that next level risk?
So I wish I knew how to answer that question, but I feel I'm way out of my depth here because it requires people, and there are people in this room who are much, much, much better than I am on the technology side. And part of the problem when you write as a lay technologically lay person who has problems with PowerPoint about technology. Case in point, thank you. Case in point is that I constantly need to assess whether I know enough about the technology, in particular, make predictions that we all know the problem with those about where the technology is going. So to give you, even we talked about cyber or the Mike Schmidt and I both belong to a disreputable group that works on killer robots, and the whole debate over killer robots, and the question is, ultimately, should human make the kill decision or not? What does it mean to have greater autonomy, humans in the loop, outside the loop? And one of the things that are always complicated in this discussion is that I don't know what the technology is capable of. So when you talk about machine learning, some people assure me, yes, we know how to stop the machine at the point of killing intelligence. It can learn all these other things. It can learn surveillance and tracking and reaching the object and maneuvering and escaping counterfire, etc. But we can teach the machine not to push the trigger without human intervention. I don't know. So then you have both the normative question of should I intervene, but also just a practical question, is this debate even, relevant? You and I can sit here and debate the wisdom of making AI technology available to industry and lay people until we're blue in the face, but the fact is, it's out there. And we can't control it. There's no way to, declare it a dangerous substance and prevent it from, and as people point out repeatedly, it does lots of wonderful things in the world. It will save a lot of lives in addition to those it might take.
Yuval.
Yeah, so
We'll go back and forth.
okay, thank you. This was very rich, and also appreciate Itamar's comments. So I too am very much concerned with the regulatory structures in the sense that we have a major problem, which is so we have a situation which you call the many-to-many, a completely decentralized problem, and we don't have a Leviathan, and we don't have a good process in place. So to regulate, and it's clear that we need that the ordinary. I mean, we cannot fight the old war. I mean, we cannot win this war while fighting the old war. So the intergovernmental or even the national, this is not going to do the trick. But the question is whether you see anything, and you've seen anything that comes close. Do we have any good examples? So the FDA is interesting. I mean, the drug regulation is using market access to certain actors, such as hospitals, HMOs, to actually introduce standards. Do we have anything analogous?
But it's also a tort model that imposes liability if something goes wrong, right? So it's a direct...
With a liability regime, but this is one country, one physical space. The question is whether this is comparable, and of course it only works because you have some key actors. When you are completely decentralized, the question is, do we have anything which we have seen which could perhaps show us the way is how to go forward? Because you need here the regulators, you need the coders, you need the companies, you need the consumers, and you need the democratic government in the same room. And how to generate such a process is something that so far we have not seen. I have not seen in a very clear way.
So, is this one working? Yes, now it's working. Great. So I'm afraid I don't have an answer. I have all kinds of thoughts, mostly random, that create kind of a menu of options. And there are many of options, not in the sense that we can choose, but we're going to see sort of kind of a hodgepodge of all these things happening. So we Itamar mentioned that this problem of the global social contract. And I think we recognize in the book, we're very, very far away from there, not even close. So if we're not even close, what's the likely thing that is going to happen? So the first move is for greater unilateralism. And so you see it in the United States. Again, take that jurisdiction as an example. Material support witness statutes, the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, where increasingly the United States extends its domestic jurisdiction extraterritorially over actors and states and players and activities that are not within the state. And if you look at the Computer Crimes Act in the United States, super broad in its reach extraterritorially, and you will see the powerful actors, I think, resorting more to more of that, all the way, if you really want to let your imagination run wild, things like targeted killing are just the next kind of step in the enforcement regime of where you're worried about people acting or operating from jurisdictions where you don't have control. Or hackbacks, or a lot of sort of unilateral enforcement measures that may or may not go through a judicial process, but are in fact you determining the rules for someone else. That's the point, right? On the flip side, you can seek greater cooperation, and it's either with like-minded states that happen to have the same similar preferences, or through sticks and carrots, basically arm twisting other jurisdiction, whether it is because you're nice to them or because you coerce them in all kinds of ways to harmonize certain legislation to cooperate in intelligence and information sharing and sort of. The private industry, as I mentioned, through CRISPR is going to have a lot to do with that. I heard a presentation from somebody from Bank of America not long ago who, it was very funny because she said Bank of America is the financial institution that is subject to the most hacking and attacks on its servers because its name is Bank of America. And people think if they target Bank of America, they're really sticking it to the United States, so they leave aside Citizens Bank or HSBC, but they go after Bank of America. And so the attempt is to sort of, for her, is to enlist all the big financial service companies to share information about, what kind of attacks were you subject to, what were the protocols used. There are a lot of disclosure laws in the United States, but many think that they do not go far enough. For instance, in disclosing how exactly you were attacked, which would force you to share vulnerabilities. Those are things that I think can develop either through the market power or through private actors, industries coming together, influencing. A lot of it will be bottom up and not top down, I think. So again, it's not a panacea. It's not, we're not going to have, I think, I hate to disappoint anyone, I would not bet on a Geneva Digital Convention anytime soon. And I think the only way would be sort of step-by-step kind of patchwork that there'll be, it won't be foolproof, but it will bring us a little bit closer every time.
Thank you. So I'd like to ask another particular question, which is how do the events during the 2016 election cycle inform your theory and the insights of your book, if at all? And I'm thinking, of course, specifically on the hacks in the Democratic National Committee and the kind of realization that maybe Russia has intervened in the elections in the United States, as well as the realization that this is the current United States president, whatever we want to do. Is this administration, can this administration be an agent of the kind of changes that you're calling for in the book?
So there's a lot there. I'm not sure I'll be able to address everything, but look, there are parts to this question that are easy as a matter of law. If you hack the computers of the DNC, you're committing a crime. And because, again, it's just follow up my response to Yuval earlier, because it's a hacked to computers that are in the United States, it doesn't matter, again, it's just a legal matter who's behind them or where they're hacked from. Consequences are in the United States, there is US jurisdiction, a crime was committed, easy. That's the easy part. I think the much more complicated part is the free speech question that we all talked about. And there are a lot of really complicated questions. Is there a freedom to speak anonymously? Is there a freedom to speak pretending that you are someone else? So and that's a completely different kind of question. Can you pretend to be someone else, and is that protected at that point? Do we think it should be protected in the same way? So we have anonymity, but we also have fake identities, not to be confused with fake news, but also fake news. And the question of the platforms that allow the dissemination of these types of dissemination of this kind of information. Are they at all responsible, and in what way? Are they legally responsible? Are they politically responsible? Are they morally responsible? And you could see that because of this sort of kind of social outrage, there's been a backlash from Facebook as the guardian of rights and freedoms around the world, all of a sudden, tide turning against them, and sort of a little bit like the evil players that allow the forces of darkness to rise against us. So I think all of these are important questions, as well as the thing you alluded to earlier, which is even the prior question, who gets to intervene in the US elections and why? So, you know, Prime Minister Netanyahu intervenes in US elections all the time, right? But he does so overtly. He goes to Congress, he speaks, doesn't hide his identity. The United States has meddled in elections in numerous places, both overtly and covertly. But it's really annoying when it's Russia for all kinds of reasons. So there are a lot of sort of, and I think also questions of who gets to have a say today in elections. So we only allow citizens to vote. Is that a legitimate line or illegitimate line? We only allow citizens to contribute to campaigns, political campaigns. Is that a legitimate line or not? We don't ever say that Mexicans can't have a view and express their view about the US elections. So there are questions that are sort of antecedent to the technological aspects. The technology, of course, exacerbates and brings it all to a greater urgency. For me, I think the lesson in all of this is the platforms and their role in all of this and how we should think about their accountability in this scheme.
Thank you.
A lot of many governance failures, many market failures, many technological failures, as you can see. A lot to be fixed. Maybe technology could be a fix. We'll continue this discussion this afternoon. Lunch is behind us. Please join me in thanking our great